After arriving home, I immediately went straight to bed to rest and recover from the prolonged exposure to the atmosphere of the truck and the items held within. It took me some time to shake the exhaustion, but once I did, it was off to work. I should take this opportunity to clarify that a key component to any real curse is intent, especially with a project like this when I use multiple objects formed together into one single product. And by intent, I mean you have to really want to cause as much pain, misery, and suffering as possible. This came easy to me as I hate people. They disgust me. I find the whole lot of them absolutely abhorrent. I want nothing but the worst to befall any of them at any time. This malice would be the tether or glue that would hold the malevolent energies to the objects as they are cut and shaped, and heated and bent. Well, of course, at the time, this was entirely theoretical, mind you. After some contemplation and sketching, I decided that I would make something of a short sword in the fashion of a Sumatran adaptation of the Ottoman yataghan. While not overly long, they possessed a wicked curve in the shape of an S. This would make the weapon cut extremely well despite its lack of size and weight. I mean, just because the thing was cursed doesn't mean it shouldn't also be functional and practical, right? After drawing out the final shape, I took to the shop and began my work. To start, I cut a long section of the circular saw blade I procured from the mill. As I began, I immediately noticed the steel was much more difficult to cut than an average saw blade, wearing down several cutting discs to the rim on a task that would normally not use up even one. A fluke, I thought, because it could have easily been under-tempered at the factory where it was made, resulting in a much harder steel than normal for such a tool. But it became apparent that this wasn't the case as I began to forge the rough shape of the blade. The steel would heat much slower than usual, and despite being brought to a bright yellow, took a great deal more force to hammer into shape. It was almost as if the steel was resisting the change to its form I was attempting to impose on it. This I found somewhat frustrating as I only had a very limited supply of the charred wood from the burned house, so I had to use it sparingly. This anomaly continued as I ground the bevels and shaped the handle and even into the quenching process. But the steel slowly gave way to my efforts and took shape. Once the steel component was ready, I began to craft the handle. I retrieved the deep black ebony cutting board from the trunk, where I had been keeping the rest of the objects to avoid the negative effects they had on me whilst driving the trunk. I started by cutting 2 separate blocks to attach to either side of the tang, the part that extends the blade to the hilt, for those that don't know. But as I did this, the teeth of the saw blade almost immediately began to dull and erode away. Not only that, the wood began to ooze a deep black, viscous fluid containing swirls of bright crimson red that caused any skin it came into contact with to severely burn and itch. It took some time to clean away any fluid that had become adhered to the table of my saw. But as it was apparent that this wasn't the tool for the job, I took out an oscillating saw and a carbonated blade used for cutting things too hard for regular steel saw blades such as ceramic tiles. Now with latex mechanical gloves, I made the second attempt at cutting the sinister material. While time-consuming, my efforts eventually paid off. After wearing down several saw blades and discovering the industrial spill solvent that could be used to dilute and clean away the fluid much more easily, I finally had the profile of the handle to cut its rough shape. Following this, I proceeded to drill the holes I would use to attach the nails, which would be used to hold the piece of the cutting board into place. During this process, I used some regular nails of the same size from the shop to avoid any unnecessary exposure to the remaining materials. Once the holes were drilled through the bleeding wood, I brought the genuine article in. After making sure they were the proper fit, I began to cut them down to the right length to be pinned flush to the rest of the handle. While not as trying as the circular saw blade, the nails were uncooperative in their own way, working much slower than the mild steel they consisted of rightfully should. I can't say for sure, but as I cut the heads of the top of the nails off, I thought I could hear the sound of a woman screaming and an infant crying over the metallic whir of the angle grinder. But I half expected to encounter such phenomena going into this endeavor, so it had little effect on the progress. Then began the attaching and shaping of the handle. At this juncture, the time I had spent around the weapon began to cause me to once again feel the familiar effects from the truck start to take hold. Everything became considerably more laborious and the progress slowed, but I persevered and finished the task at hand. Once that was complete, I entered the compartment of the truck one last time to retrieve the cord I had taken from the homeless man's corpse. Wrapping the handle with a cord was decidedly the easiest part of the entire ordeal, and might have been relaxing if not for the feeling of deathly illness hanging over me at the time. Once that was done, I put the final sharpened edge on and sat back to look at what I had created. Now this might seem like a pretty quick process because the writing, but rest assured this took several weeks of work due to the material's unwillingness to cooperate. As I sat there in my shop, I noticed something. The sickness I had felt had lifted, leaving me with an even greater sense of accomplishment and relief. My theory as to why is that perhaps now that this thing was finished, it was truly mine. I had made it through the arduous trial of bringing the sword into being, and now it and all the darkness it held answered to me. The curse was mine. It was definitely a severely cursed object, but what effect would it have on a random person? I thought this to myself, thinking of how best to evaluate the properties of something as unprecedented as what was surely the most cursed single object in the world. The first test was to remove the blade from the shop and gather the remnants of the items used to create it. I made sure the sword was a significant distance away and then placed the remaining objects in the shop with me. After sitting there for the better part of 30 minutes, I concluded that the entirety, not just the part, of the negative energies attached to these various materials had transferred to the sword. This meant that the final result was already better than I had expected. It was definitely evil, but just how evil I had to know. For the next test, I made a modest display and mounted it in my living room. I then invited an acquaintance, who we shall call Jerry, over under the premise of helping me move a couch, on account of I had hurt my back lifting a heavy piece of machinery a few days before. As we entered the living room, he immediately was drawn to the weapon sitting in wait on its stand. He inched carefully towards it with an inquisitive gaze in his eye. As he reached out to touch the hilt, I asked from behind, "Like that one, huh?" and chuckled as he nearly leapt out of his skin from the scare. Yeah. Just something about it. Looks kinda different from your usual stuff, though. I just felt like trying something new. Shake things up, you know?" I said, attempting to feign friendly conversation. "Touch it, if you like." He reached out and took hold of the handle, picking it up from its display. "It's really nice," he said after examining it for a moment. "Something about it feels right. He continued, his face beginning to turn a pale white, and the look of mild nausea washing across as he added, I think I need to lie down. I don't feel so great." As I reached out to take the blade from his now trembling hand, I told him that perhaps it's best if we try to tackle the couch another time, and that he should probably go home to rest. He agreed and left soon after, apologizing for not being of any help. Little did he know just how helpful he had been. I now knew that the sword possessed some form of hypnotic pull that drew people to it, and the effect it had on them was not only potent, but fast-acting. This only served to further arouse my curiosity. I had to know what the prolonged effects of exposure would be. It was then I had an idea. After a few days, Jerry returned to proceed with the relocation of the couch. After a little work and a lot of acting to fake the non-existent pain, I told him how earlier that week it was done. Before he left, I handed him a large, flat box containing the sword, and told him that it was a small token of my appreciation, and to open it when he got home. This was partly to test to see if the aluminum foil I had lined the box with would at least lessen the effects of the object. Knowing he had several errands to run before he would return home that day, I hastened to make my way to his empty house, where I proceeded to place small hidden cameras I had purchased at a local electronics shop the day before all around his domicile. Once I finished, I quickly departed before he and his family could return. I made my way back to my house, where I made sure all the camera feeds were up and working properly. Then sat back and waited patiently for Jerry's return. He walked through the door at about 5:30 that afternoon. His wife and 2 teenage children had arrived earlier, around at 4:25. His wife was in the kitchen, and his oldest child, a son of around 17, was in the living room watching TV, while his youngest, a daughter around 15, had taken to her room upon entering the home and was doing whatever 15-year-old girls do alone in their rooms. Now I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. I'm a monster, not a pervert. I watched only enough footage to know their locations at any given time. Jerry was the one I was interested in. I watched as he sat the box down on the table and told his wife about my uncharacteristically generous gift. He opened the box, revealing the sword he had been admiring so fervently the other day. He even smiled as he read the note aloud to his wife, which said, "Jerry, I know you've admired my work since as long as we've known each other. I'm also aware that my work is far from cheap and that your family and their financial needs always have to come first. So I hope you will accept this token of gratitude for helping an injured old man in a time of need. Careful, it's very sharp." Over the next several days, I watched as he would make time to be alone with the thing, sneaking out of bed at night and often retreating to his garage, where he would admire and caress the blade in the unlit place. His appearance began to diminish from day to day as well. He went from a healthy, vital man to a man with a visage not too unlike a cancer patient after undergoing months of heavy chemotherapy treatments. I watched in enthrallment as the drama unfolded between him and his wife, as she seemingly pleaded with him to go to the hospital to find out the cause of his deteriorating health. It also seemed he was keeping some form of journal on his laptop, possibly containing some insight into what he was going through as the effects took hold. Then things took a rather exciting turn on the 4th night. After sitting alone in the dark garage for the better part of an hour, he lifted up the leg of his shorts and began to make long, wavy cuts up and down his thigh. Blood ran down either side of his bleeding leg and began to pool at his feet. After a few minutes of this, he stood and opened the door connecting the garage to the rest of the house and walked through. I followed him on the cameras as he made his way to the bedroom door, behind which was his sleeping wife. He slowly opened the door and stepped through. Once inside, he stood in silence at the foot of their bed and watched her sleep for about 20 or so minutes, before apparently coming to his senses. Realizing the pain in his leg, he also noticed the source and the mess it had created. I could almost see his brain working to come up with a believable lie to explain away the bloodstains all over the floor. I was largely uninterested in the footage that followed for the bulk of the next day, as things didn't seem to pick up until the night when everything was quiet and calm. That evening, I sat down at my computer monitor and began to observe as usual. Things went on as they had the past few nights up until everyone had fallen asleep. Without warning, Jerry slipped out of bed and went straight for the blade sitting on its display in his office once again. I shifted in my chair at the sight of the activity. However, this time he did not go to the garage, but instead walked back down the hall and into his son's room, where he stood for only a moment before lifting the blade high above his head and bringing it back down into the middle of his son's face. Then again, he raised it up and cut down into the now dead body lying in the bed, moving lower and lower down the corpse with each stroke, removing arms, spilling intestines, and severing legs as he went. By the time he was done, the bed was covered in the dismembered and almost unrecognizable body of what used to be a teenage boy. The next room he entered was his own, where again his wife slept peacefully, unaware of the carnage unfolding in her own home. This time he did not hesitate in his actions. He did, however, start from the bottom up. The first swing took off both of her feet, causing her to awake in pain and terror as the next swing landed near her knees, cutting one completely in half, and the other only the end of the blade made contact, leaving the footless calf dangling a few uncut muscles and tendons. The next stroke landed on her pelvic region, causing her insides to flood and the bed to mix with blood already soaked into the fabric. The next swing took both of her hands and sank into her chest as she held them up in a futile attempt to protect herself from her possessed husband, followed by several more chops to her face that brought silence and stillness back to the room, all except for the daughter, who was awoken by the horrific screams of her dying mother. She stood in the doorway, paralyzed by fear at the scene in front of her eyes. A small peep signaled her presence, causing the possessed man, who she only knew hours ago as her father, to snap his blood-stained face over his shoulder in her direction. With little time to process the situation, Jerry wheeled around, marching towards her in the most predatory of fashions before one clean swipe of the razor-sharp instrument caused two halves of the frightened girl to softly bounce to the side of the doorframe as they fell to the floor. Jerry's next action was to immediately place the tip of the blade up to his open eye before running full speed into the wall at the other end of the long hallway, driving the entire length of the thing through his head. I watched wide-eyed. One hand, which I had not noticed, had risen to cover my mouth that was now hanging open in shock and awe as he fell to the ground, joining his family in a grim death. I only allowed myself a moment to take everything in before snapping back to my senses. I snatched up a bag of tools I had ready just in case and made haste to the scene. Getting in was easy, and he had left the door unlocked. I had no need to be quiet, just quick. I gathered every one of the hidden cameras and placed them into my bag before retrieving the murder weapon. It didn't occur to me until this point that the murder weapon would still have to be accounted for in the investigation that would follow. I made my way into the garage and removed an old machete he had hanging on the pegboard with the rest of his tools. I groaned as I noticed the edge was far too dull to inflict the wounds that had been found upon closer inspection of the bodies, so I hurriedly snatched up a bastard file and worked the edge into something feasibly sharp enough to cause such damage. As I made my way out of the garage, I glimpsed into the son's room, noticing the first cut had landed dead center of his mouth. Fucking teeth, I complained to myself. I then slipped into the room and examined the remains just to make sure, and I could in fact see tiny fragments of broken teeth strewn over the pillow where his head once rested. God damn it all, I hissed to myself, taking the screwdriver out of my bag to dent the otherwise pristine edge of the machete before making sure to cover the thing with blood, before doing the same with the wife and other child. I then made my way to Jerry, where I removed the object from his skull before reinserting the machete into the empty cavity. This took little effort as the blade of the sword was noticeably narrower than the blade of the machete. But with a hard shove, the tip popped out the back of his head and sunk in the rest of the way with no trouble. Taking one last pass to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything, I crept back out into the night, and then back to the comfort and safety of my own home. But not before making sure to copy and delete all of his most recent journal entries from his laptop. All in all, I would say that even as of now, this undertaking has been a huge success, causing noticeable deterioration in health, appearance, and mental stability in the first day, and possessed a man to brutally murder his entire family, then himself by the fifth. Those are results far past anything I could have hoped for. But I decided to take this even farther. As of now, I've put the sword out into circulation, and after getting the idea from Jerry's journal, I've been tracking the sword's progress online. I'll be sure to keep you all updated with the accounts of these incidents caused by my little experiment as I find them and compile the relevant information. Which shouldn't be too hard, as the thing leaves a very easy trail to follow, if you know what to look for. Until next time, my dear readers.